I'm Jody Kovach, the curator of academic programs. And on behalf of the Gun Gallery, it's my pleasure to welcome Gun Gallery collection artist Laura McPhee, whose work features prominently in our current exhibition, The Art of Trees. Behind me here, you will see one of two of Laura's photographs that are currently on display in the exhibition. The title of this piece is Quartered Rocky Mountain Elk, Milky Creek, White Cloud Mountains, Idaho. And its sublime power never fails to captivate audiences. The paradoxical violence and reverence of this scene challenges our understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world and provokes deep intellectual questions over the course of the years have engaged Kenyan students in curricular-based discussions in courses such as biology, English, Spanish, Russian, political science, philosophy, environmental studies, classics, and just a few minutes ago, Italian. Today, Laura will talk with us about her large-scale photographic landscapes such as this, and will share with us how her art practice engages with the consequences of humanity's efforts to control, manage, and exploit nature. Laura earned her Bachelor of Arts in Art History from Princeton University, summa cum laude, and an MFA in photography from the Rhode Island School of Design. She is a professor of photography at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and her work is represented in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the J. Paul Getty Center Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So Laura, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you now.
All right, well, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I wish I were there physically with you instead of in a little box. But, and I wish I could be on your campus and see this wonderful exhibition, The Art of Trees, which includes work by some of my favorite artists, including Jennifer Steinkamp. And thanks to Jody Kovach for keeping me in mind for 2 years in a row, and Carolyn Colbert for bearing with me on the technology. And also special thanks to the student curators who worked on the show, Willow, Katie, and Rebecca. Their interest in the environmental crisis we face and how art operates at the intersection with science and politics reflects my own concerns. And it always makes me feel good when young people are thinking this way. It was terrific to spend some time also reflecting on how important trees have been in my work. I was kind of amazed as I went through my work how much it revolves around them. So I am going to share with you some thoughts about the environment and art and photography that have been on my mind lately. Through this last year, the issue of COVID and how it got here and how that relates to climate change has been on everybody's mind. How we live on our shared planet, how we plan for a future determined by the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere are questions that are increasingly urgent in my mind and work. I find that I'm driven more and more to foreground that. But before we go on to the heavy stuff, I have a couple of digressions. And the first is personal history, which bears on my work. And the second is a kind of thought experiment from a writer I admire. So I like to begin with the words of two writers I admire and with a small piece of my own family history on my mother's side. The novelist Eudora Welty wrote Place Above All Else, and I link that to the words of the writer Cormac McCarthy, the world of our fathers resides within us. I want to gender bend that a little as it brings me to my great grandmother, Glenna Idalia Stewart. I keep this tiny portrait of Glenna, a woman who died long before I was born, on my dresser where I see it every day. Glenna came from Ohio, married there, and then around 1912 up and left, heading west by train with her two daughters, then around 5 and 8, leaving in her wake a note to her husband and extended family. If you're interested, you can read all about this adventure in a novel by my sister Martha called An Elegant Woman. My great-grandmother taught in schoolhouses like this one in Winston, Montana. From the notes on the photos written by my grandmother, she was there in the winter of 1914. She got off the train in Montana because no formal training was required in order to teach there. But complicating things was the fact that school teachers were not permitted to have families, and divorcees were, of course, less than acceptable. So my grandmother and her sister were hidden away in nearby towns, in boarding houses and the cabins of strangers. Glenna's employment and thus her whereabouts changed nearly every year. Schoolhouses were funded as long as 7 children attended. When the number of students dropped, the teacher was sent to a more populous place. Ultimately, Glenna taught school in one-room schoolhouses all over the Northwest. She taught the children of Basque shepherds and miners in towns like this one, photographed in 1880 by Carlton Watkins. She taught in little down at the heel towns until she died, including in this one in Goldfield, Nevada, which was at one time one of the richest places in the West, with a saloon that employed 80 bartenders on any given shift. But by the time she reached Goldfield, it was already falling apart. Nonetheless, she was supposed to be principal of a fancy new school there, and that school still stands, but just barely. When I made this image of an abandoned house in Goldfield, I was thinking not only about the emptying of rural places, but also about the invasive plant brought by the Spanish for erosion control, the very pretty but water-guzzling tamarisk. Someone sent me this stereo view. A friend just sent it to me in the mail, and it's so perfect for me because when I think about how we perceive landscape and what it means, I like to look at this card. It seems to speak to the idea of how we see progress. I put myself in that man's shoes and imagine how differently I might have seen this scene in the 1930s and how I see it now in 2021. From the Keystone Tour of the World 400 card set, it's clear that this was a wonder of the world in the 1930s. Now it speaks to our addiction to fossil fuels, to the way we squeeze the earth like an orange, causing earthquakes in Arkansas, to pollution of water and air, but minds were not full of that then. This was destiny manifesting. This is a photograph of my grandmother and her sister before leaving Ohio, and the rifle seems somehow prophetic. Anyway, what Glenna left for me was a map of the West, a sort of mysterious treasure hunt that I go on as I look for my photographs, for her history and for the history of women across the region, and especially the rural West. Her concerns did not much coincide with mine beyond being a teacher, and my family appears to be full of them. Like the man in the last image, she was born long before the landscape was thought to be desecrated. When she looked out at human interventions on the land, whether it was railroads or mines, she, I'm sure, saw progress. And now on to my second digression. I'd like to talk for a minute about language by reminding you of the wonderful English writer Robert Macfarlane's book, Landmarks, but also observation about how recent editions of the Oxford Junior Dictionary, which is aimed at 7-year-olds, dropped certain nature words that its editors deemed less relevant to the lives of modern children. These included acorn, dandelion, fern, nectar, otter, pasture, bluebell, willow. The terms introduced in their place included broadband, blog, cut and paste, MP3 player, bullet point, celebrity, chat room, and voicing it. So he argues, and I would argue too, that naming things and associating those things with specific words and experiences, and I would argue visual images, is essential to caring for something, even to seeing that thing at all. As the natural world is replaced by the virtual, we lose our feeling for it and our understanding of the world outdoors. And now on to the landscape work. So this is a snapshot as I began my life as a landscape photographer, and it's not in the West. This is in Iceland, where I first went with my father in 1986. He was doing research for an essay in a book called The Control of Nature. So I come by this interest in the control of nature through my family. So when I started photography, I was interested in the psychological, I was interested in the family, I was interested in culture. I was not interested in nature or in landscape. But Iceland had a profound effect on me. It seemed so turbulent, it made me want to picture it. And the following year, I returned there with a friend named Virginia Bean, who had been a student in Emmett Gowan's Introduction to Photography class. And I like to pay homage to my teacher, Emmett Gowan, who really made it possible for me to imagine doing what I've done in my life. So we rented a Ford Pinto, which was a little teeny car, and circumnavigated the island. We had two of every kind of camera we could lay our hands on. And we didn't know what we were doing in terms of photography. We just experimented. So one of the cameras we have is what you see here, which is an 8x10 view camera at Deerdorf specifically. I think those sneakers have probably worn out a long time ago, and I have replaced the black plastic with a proper piece of material as a dart bar. So we did it that year, and then the next year we went back and we circumnavigated again. We decided in that time to collaborate, and we began that collaboration almost without discussion. It just seemed more practical to us to work together, and so we started doing so. In the second year that we went back there, we had kind of narrowed down from, we had the first year, we had 35, we had 2 1/4, we had Polaroid backs, we had every conceivable analog thing. And then the second year when we went, we more or less had gravitated to the 8x10 view camera and to color film. So that was a big decision. Anyway, we made this picture, which I still feel is emblematic of so much of the work that I have made in my life. We couldn't have said it then, but it's a picture of something that is in truth entirely benign, but it really doesn't look so benign. It's geothermally heated hot water being pumped out of the ground to supply the people of Reykjavik. But paradoxically, it looks frightening and malevolent. It's about leisure, but it's also about work. It's beautiful, the light's beautiful, but there's a kind of fear in it, and so there's tension. So paradox abounds, as it does in much of my work. For 12 years, Virginia Bean and I worked together, photographing landscape all over the world, looking at the relationship between people and nature. First in volcanic landscapes like Hawaii and Iceland, which are both hotspots on spreading centers, and then in other places. Actually, Hawaii is not on a spreading center, but they're both hotspots, geologically speaking. Our interests expanded to include all kinds of interactions between people and nature. And we were fascinated by the kind of back and forth of it. So this image is lava, 2,000 degrees, flowing into the ocean. The little sticks you can see in the right background, those are the remains of the visitor center. And the cones are what are supposed to keep you back from this lava. Of course, it wasn't working very well. There were a lot of people gathered there to watch this lava flow into the sea. But we learned that we're part of nature, one species among many, extraordinary in our ingenuity and consciousness, but not alone in that, perhaps either. We came to recognize that no part of the Earth's surface is unaltered by human activity, that the idea of an external autonomous nature is a myth. Our interest lay in looking at the ways in which people are engaged with long, complex dialogue with the land. This is a volcano on the Strip in Las Vegas. So the supposed lava is actually water, but the water is ancient, prehistoric water that is stored underground naturally, of course, and that once you take it out, it's gone. So that's a lot of evaporation happening right there. So now I'm going to skip decades and bodies of work in the interest of time and retaining your attention. So it's now about 2002, and I was offered a residency in Idaho, and I thought I really had to think hard about it. Why would I want to go to Idaho? I wasn't photographing the West in particular. The West, I hadn't fully thought about the resonances for the West that were my own particular history. I'm from New Jersey. I really didn't feel like the West was the place for me, but in the end, I accepted this. And it wasn't a very demanding thing. I could sit and read, or I could take pictures, and I could do what I wanted. So I decided to go. And thus I found myself on a ranch in a cabin with this view. And this is June 21st, the summer solstice. And yes, that is snow. And my grandmother was on my mind. She'd been dead 8 years then, but she remains an important figure in my life. Verbally creative, a consummate drama queen, admirer of all things beautiful. I imagined my grandmother standing in similar places, looking at all this splendor. And I thought about how she would have seen it differently, how her feet might have hurt from walking, or that mountains might have meant many more hours of hot, arduous riding. As we traveled to this ranch, we came down a pass, and as we reached the valley floor, we saw a small brown Forest Service sign which read Headwaters, River of No Return. I wrote it down, River of No Return. I thought then that my grandmother's subjective experience was almost entirely lost to me, that actually we only get glimmers of one another in any case, but still she could stand there beside me. To rephrase McCarthy, the world of our mothers resides within us. So I started to meet people. There weren't that many, only 100 people lived in this valley, and they appeared to live in a kind of harmony with the natural world. So I guess I was stunned to discover the number of contentious issues that divided people even here. In fact, I started a list in my notebook called Bones of Contention. It included things like mining, logging, dams, preservation versus development, reintroduction of wolves, reintroduction of grizzlies, endangered species and extinctions, particularly salmon, feeding elk in winter, hunting and firearms, bear, elk, pronghorn, cougar, birds, mountain pine beetle infestation, water rights and irrigation, fire and suppression policy. And although this was my own country, and I didn't have any frame of reference or little frame of reference for these things. So it was amazing and wonderful way of learning about the West and about the kinds of decisions we make. So this is, I call this my conception picture, but it's really a picture of sockeye salmon fry in a hatchery. So little teeny baby sockeye salmon. And they're in a blue plastic sink, and you're seeing the fluorescence reflected in the sink. But to me, one of the most compelling stories that is in this area, in this valley, is that of the endangered species, the sockeye salmon. The Snake River sockeye migrate farther and higher than any other sockeye population on the planet. They swim 900 miles to the sea, dropping 7,000 feet in altitude, crossing 4 dams on the Columbia and 4 dams on the Snake. And they pass through 450 miles of slack water, which is the still water that backs up on dams. They're 4 inches long when they set out. And when they, then they get to the sea, and not a lot of them make it, but they get to the sea, and they spend 2 years in the Pacific. They go, it's not clear exactly where they go, although we're figuring that out more now. But then they come back and they return to their natal lakes to spawn and die. So back up the 7,000 feet in altitude, the 8 dams, and so on and so forth. So while the return of sockeye salmon has often been in the single digits, since the 8 dams were completed, for example, in the 90s, the whole decade, only 16 fish came back. Now, after 20 years of effort, millions of dollars spent on hatchery programs, returns can vary from 40 to 4,000 fish. The government's created a massive hatchery program, which produces 1 million fish a year, but those fish are genetically inferior. And after releasing millions of these fry, only 17 have actually returned. But when you think about the dams, the fish, there used to be so many you could walk across the river on their bodies. That was what was said about them. The hundreds of millions of dollars, the studies, and so on, there's a certain kind of absurdity to it all. In 2015, low snowpack, diminished streams, early heat waves conspired to increase water temperatures, resulting in the death of more than 98% of the adults returning to the nursery lakes. And climate scientists expect this to be the norm by mid-century. This year, we're in an extreme drought. Ocean survival is poor. Salmon are experiencing thiamine deficiencies because they've been forced to switch their diets. And it all conspires to show that we're in a kind of extinction vortex. And so why are fish important? This is one of our last natural food sources. And it's not only as a food source for humans and other animals, but also because they bring marine derived nutrients to the interior. There's a really terrific documentary called Damnation, which explores all of this if you're interested. In it, this geologist, David Montgomery, comments that here was the perfect food. It came just swimming up to your doorstep, and the fish care for themselves, full of omegas and proteins, and they do everything. They return to their home lakes without any help from us. If we just could bring ourselves to harvest only half of them, they would replace themselves. So he asks, what kind of species wouldn't protect this resource? And I guess there's only one answer to that. This is a photograph of the Sunbeam Dam, which is right near the Sawtooth Valley. And for 50 years, this dam, it was used briefly, and then it was just left across the river. So the fish would swim up and then knock their heads on this dam. And after 50 years, it was finally taken out. So I like to think about this sentence from the great naturalist John Muir's writing, when we try to pick out anything by itself. we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. This is an image of a biologist. She's in her nightgown, she's outside her house, and this is telemetry equipment that she is holding. So wolves that are radio collared, they had been recently introduced to this area. And that's a question that I really struggle with too, is like, when we ask ourselves, as we reintroduce things, wolves, grizzlies, whatever species, to what version of nature are we trying to return? What is it that we're looking for? So she's holding telemetry equipment so that she can follow the wolves and attempt to minimize negative interactions with livestock and wolves. This is Isaac Babcock, who was a biologist for the Nez Perce, and he's dressed for tranquilizing and collaring reintroduced wolves. And here's that picture. So, as I said, I'm from New Jersey, so I have I have ambivalent feelings, and had them more strongly in the past about guns and about hunting. And I think that living here, I'm in Idaho now, what has taught me to think really differently about that. And in particular, even this, where having a direct experience with the food that you eat is very different than getting it in the supermarket. And this is not trophy hunting, this is hunting for food. So I love this picture, and I love this picture of trees, because if you could see it closely, which you can because it's at your school, but you can see that the Basque shepherds and then later Peruvian shepherds would inscribe their names into the bark of the aspen trees, and the year, and that remains there. So I tried very hard to look at all the bones of contention that were in my notebook, and there was one part that I hadn't been able to address because I didn't want to start a fire. But at the very end of my time here, I got a call that there was a fire in the valley. And so I was back in Boston teaching, but I came back to Idaho. And what had happened was that a man on a ranch he was moving, and he put trash in a burn barrel, and it was the end of summer, and there's this pine beetle, which you can see in the lower part of the picture, has already basically wiped out a lot of trees. So there's a lot of fuel on the ground, in part because of the pine beetle, and in part because our policy has been, although it's shifting a lot now in the wake of the big fires in all across the West, that as soon as a fire starts, the policy has been to put it out. And that means that you accumulate a tremendous amount of fuel on the ground. So anyway, sparks escaped, and that was it. 41,000 acres, talk about unintended consequences, burned in a 10-day period. And the government spent $11 million to try to suppress it, but ultimately it burned until the snow fell. After the fire, I was finished more or less with my project in the Sawtooth Valley. My residency had long since concluded, and I thought that I was done and probably would never return to the river of no return. So unintended consequences abound in land management policy. it's fascinating to follow those stories. And I think that Elizabeth Colbert does a beautiful job of that in her new book. The title has something to do with the white sky. And that latest idea is being floated is to whiten the sky to reflect sunlight back out into space in a bid to halt global climate change. What could go wrong? So I was done with the river of no return. But life is funny, and mine threw me a lot of curveballs, as most people's do. And in any case, I did go back for an exhibition in Boise, and I found myself wanting to see what had happened in the aftermath of the fire. What I found was encouraging rather than horrifying, in part because of the formal beauty of what happened there, and in part because the landscape became a metaphor for both loss, which I had experienced a really significant loss at that point in my life, and the regenerative power of natural life cycles. So the white trees that you're seeing, they are dead. They were destroyed in the fire. But the green at the base of them is all aspen regeneration. And aspens are cool plants because cool trees. They are among the very biggest organisms on the planet because they're all connected underground and they're actually one big organism. They're just clones. So, and the other thing that happens is where you had monocultures before, you find that all these seeds lie in the earth. And so there's this incredible flowering and abundance of species and a new beauty that wasn't there before. So now I'm going to show you work that I've been doing over the past decade in the high desert West. And there are thematic through lines you certainly recognize. There's autobiography in the form of the map Glenna left me, and in images of my family, and also my preoccupations with time and geology, and the ever more apparent effects of land management decisions and climate change. I think of this work as a way of bearing witness to I actually go and see things like fracking and other forms of extraction that support the way of life most of us, including me, pursue. On the other hand, making this work always reminds me of the intense and diverse beauty of the world and of human ingenuity and imagination. It gives me solace in that I also recognize that the timeline of the planet is long and human existence has occurred in the geologic equivalent of a blink of the eye. This is the Great Salt Lake, close to the mistaken path of the Donner Party. It caused them a month's delay, and it was a consequential decision. This was in a wet year, so this is the bottom of the Mancos Sea in the Cretaceous, but now you can see it's all exposed, and there are all kinds of, when you can see this close up, there are many different kinds of footprints and tracks, from erosion to ATVs to different animals and humans. This is the Wood River as it passes through a lava flow. The lava was generated from a hotspot that's now, because of the passing of the plates over the hotspot coming up out of the center of the earth, that hotspot is now hundreds of miles to the east in Yellowstone Park. This is a fire in the Blackrock Desert, another ancient seabed, but this one's been dry for about 13,000 years or so. So, and this one is the intersection of geological and human history in the White River Narrows in Nevada, a solar calendar made by Native Americans that can be read only on the solstice, never in snow. And then on the right, different eras of graffiti, petroglyphs, and bullet holes all combined. This is High Rock Canyon in Nevada, and that's the emigrant trail to Oregon, which was a very busy place at one time and now not so much. So my diptychs are not meant only to extend the frame, but to shift perspective, both visual and in terms of meaning. This is the Snake River Canyon below the dam at Shoshone Falls. And I would just point out the electrical poles that are up there. As I work in the West, I ask myself a lot of questions. What do we mean by wilderness? What's our responsibility to the other creatures that share the earth with us and to each other? So this Snake River Canyon below the Shoshone Falls was famously photographed by Timothy O'Sullivan. My husband always says I'm pointing the camera the wrong way. Obviously looking not at the true drama here, but I have also found that Timothy O'Sullivan looked the wrong way too, so it makes me feel better. This is the Salmon Falls Dam, and there are neither salmon nor falls here anymore. There would have been Chinook. It's leaky because it's made of lava rock, but it's beautiful anyway. This is slack water behind the Brownlee Dam on the Snake River on the Oregon-Idaho border. It's part of the Hells Canyon Dam complex that blocked a third of Idaho's habitat for salmon. And this is a historical picture of Celilo Falls on the Columbia River. And it's one of the longest, it's been inhabited for 15,000 years until now, because it was such an amazing fishery. Millions of fish passed by there, 20 million salmon passed by that falls every year. And it was it was one of the greatest fishing sites in North America and sacred to the Native Americans. But when they built the Dolls Dam on the Columbia, this was completely flooded. So at one point, when they let water out of that dam, they asked the Native Americans if they would like to be able to just fish at Celilo again for a day or two, and they said no, it would be too painful. Now this is traditional fishing on the Klickitat River, which is a tributary of the Columbia nearby. So they fish with spears. You can see the spears, and they fish from platforms, the Native Americans. There aren't so many trees in the desert, but this is, my husband and I like to call this one perfect cottonwood. And it's on the Truckee River in Nevada. And the Truckee River is running out there, hard to imagine, but there were once Chinook-sized cutthroat trout running the river, and which again was an important source of protein for indigenous people. I don't usually take pictures like this, but I just felt so compelled to. It's at Joshua Tree National Park, and it's a camping area where someone had set this up, and there are rocks on everything, including in the little bowl of dog water. So I couldn't resist it. And these are Choya Cactus also at Joshua Tree, and the range, the habitable range for these plants too is diminishing. As I've looked at the big picture, I've also liked to look down and make pictures on the ground of what things I just find there. So they're kind of found still lives, and you can see little plastic toys, and I think there's a penny, and there's all kinds of bottle caps and old pieces of hardware. And this is on a playa on a dry seabed, and all this, and little piece of glass, all this stuff just blows into low spots and makes these amazing, still lifes. So sometimes I photograph what people are doing in the landscape in a very direct way. This is the Army Ammunition Depot at Hawthorne, Nevada. So they stored old ammunition and old different kinds of weapons here. And I also like some of making pictures of rural towns clinging to some of their former glory. I happen to love Ealing, Nevada, where I made a few of these pictures. As I was following Glenna around the West, we found her in places where her life intersected with my husband's family's life. They were sheep ranchers, also in eastern Nevada. And so there were lots of stories about, especially the male people, that you can find if you go to historical societies and so on, or in the Library of Congress. And you can find lots of stories about his family because there were lots of men, but way fewer stories about, especially people like my grandmother, single women in the West. This is a floor in a house that was abandoned in the 70s, but it was entirely made of railroad ties. This is a gold mine on the edge of the Blackrock Desert, and I just was so moved and astonished by the way in which you open the skin of the earth, and there's this ruddy, just red kind of beating heart in the middle of it. It's a cyanide heap leach mine, which means that the miners move 30 to 100 tons of rock and pour gallons of cyanide over it that then goes out to the bottom there. And they do that, the 30 to 100 tons of rock for every ounce of gold. And 80% of which ends up in ornaments. Mine too, yes. This is a lavender pit turquoise silver mine in Bisbee, Arizona. And another still life on the Navajo reservation, which I found really interesting because of how you can date things, that the pop caps that have changed on soda bottles, or the types of zippers, and the metal for toothpaste tubes and so on. So this is a road to the Livingston mine at 10,000 feet in the summer, obviously. This is an open pit coal mine in Kemmerer, Wyoming. And so you can see the kind of way that the earth gets offset by faulting. And I found it so moving to see this. I mean, I had no idea what coal mining would look like. I spent about a week trying to break into this place to take a picture because I'm allergic to asking permission. And finally, I was leaving town and I thought, well, maybe I should just call them. And they were like, yeah, come on, we'll take you on a tour with your 8x10 view camera. It's fine. So live and learn. Anyway, once they dig deep enough, the water table comes up, and that's a lot of toxicity. But I'm pursuing the idea of a visual understanding of how we get and use energy. And this would be the old way of making charcoal. These are charcoal films near Ealing, Nevada. A coal-fired electric generating station in Utah. and what we're getting all this energy for. So this is L&L Auto Salvage in Gooding, Idaho. And then a marooned gas station, which was marooned by the fact that the old Route 80 was abandoned. So the new interstate it's right in the background, but it means that the little towns slowly die and people gas up and eat at service plazas. The tree in this is in the front yard, the trees of a switch operator. So right beside this railroad, which is right beside a playa, again in a seabed in a very remote part of Nevada, but a job long since made redundant by technology. The train in the Great Salt Lake. My daughter's at Spiral Jetty, by also on the Salt Lake. I don't usually photograph petroglyphs, but this one of a crying house, and obviously a European style house. I couldn't resist that either. These are flares from oil production on the Fort Berthold Reservation near the town of Mandaree in the Bakken oil shale of North Dakota. So there were limits on how much gas could be burned. As they're getting out oil, gas comes along with it, and then they burn it off because it's too expensive, supposedly, to capture it. And there were limits on how much gas could be burned, but this was relaxed and not enforced at all during the Trump administration. So the gas is just in our way. So when we made this picture, it was night. We were stopped by the side of the road, and 3 women, tribal members, kindly stopped to see if we were having car trouble. And we explained we were taking a picture. My husband said, "It's so amazing." Yeah, they said, "You can't hear yourself think. You can't breathe the air. You can't, you can't breathe the air." So standing by these wells, as I wish every American with an opinion about gas, oil, and climate change could do, is a weird and chastening experience. The light covers the ground as if you're in a stadium, and the sound is a roar emitted from the earth. The heat seems to burn, as does the knowledge that you're breathing toxic air you can't see. And all this sometimes in the middle of a wheat field and other times on undeveloped public land like this in Montana. This is a solar installation outside Tonopah, and it's another source of heat so intense that birds mistaking the mirrors, the huge house-sized mirrors underneath, they mistake them for water, plunge into the light, and they're immediately vaporized. Nothing falls to the ground. So it reminds us that no matter how we approach the problem, there's a problem with balsa wood and wind turbines when we've destroyed balsa forests in Ecuador. So there are lithium, we need lithium mines for car batteries, for Tesla. So no matter what we do, there are consequences, and how we sort that out is, I think, the challenge we face. So this is Coastal Route 1 in California. It's the end of the road. So quickly, I'm going to tell you that in this period of COVID, I've been sticking closer to home, which is in central Idaho right now. And I have been making pictures around the place where I am located. And pictures that involve my family, that's my daughter, but also people who are devoting themselves to the production of food. I've thought a lot about Candide and the idea that we must cultivate our own garden, even though I know that Candide, or Optimism, is a book about the death of hope. But I'm always hopeful because the world's so astonishing. My nephew, they were completely fascinated with the rattlesnake skins. My niece in the river. I've been thinking a lot about how we're tied to certain spots on the earth and that places can be as precious in our minds as our closest family members. And we also look for ways to link ourselves to the past and to imagine the future. I love the idea, as Faulkner put it, that the past is never dead. It's not even past. So where are we now? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gives us about 10 years to reduce our CO2 emissions by 50% and 30 years to bring it to zero. Most of us, myself included, cannot imagine how to make those changes. What we can do is bear witness and keep those problems at the center of our conversations. And we must hope that the future will surprise us. Thank you very much. I would be happy also to answer any questions.
Laura, I have a question for you. Actually, I have a few questions, but I'll just start with I'm wondering if you could talk about the camera that you use.
Yes, I was even going to set it up and I didn't do it. But it's basically it's a big mahogany box that has to sit on a tripod. It's called an 8x10 view camera. So every sheet of film is 8x10 inches. And so you load one at a time into the back. And the reason that I continue to use this, even in the day of digital, is that, and I do have a digital camera and I use it for things, but I don't really use it to make my work. I really like the way it enforces a kind of slow approach to the world and a slow interaction with whatever it is that I choose to photograph. And because it's also very, very, very expensive to make a picture, it makes me not do things that, oh, okay, I feel I've done that before. It's familiar. I'm not going to do it again. I want to take risks on pictures more than make the same picture. So I suppose, I mean, I'm not in any way musical, but I always think that if you have something like a very special instrument, it's like that for me. So.
So I have a question, Laura, and I apologize. I got late to your presentation, so I missed a lot of your pictures, and I really feel badly after having seen the ones that I did see. But I'm curious, have you been teaching your photography courses remotely, and how has that been different than teaching them in person?
It's so different, and it's getting old at this point, but I actually have been teaching remotely since last March. So like most people, I think. And it has been really wonderful in a certain way because it made me rethink things, which, you know, I've been teaching for decades. It's a nice thing to rethink things and figure out, how do you interact with people? How do you have a more personal relationship with people when you're online and divided from them physically? And there's so many cues you can't get, and so much of the casual conversation is so important in teaching. And I think that one of my main regrets about Zoom is that when it ends, you're just cut off. It's not like after class, you're sitting around So I do things like make an effort to call people individually, which is not the same thing, but I would have never done that before. So it's different, and spend more time with people individually, make sure that I'm really keeping up with how people are thinking and feeling, because I think COVID just has had a huge impact on how we all feel about the world too. So yeah.
So if I could just follow up, so your students are obviously dispersed widely, and thus have available to them many more subjects to photograph. Have you seen a substantial difference in the types of photographs that they've taken as a result, and has that been a good thing?
I think it cuts both ways, and just to be completely honest, but yes, I think that the slowing down part of what has happened is good for them in the sense, in one way, because they are really thinking and paying attention. I've been thinking about writing an essay for this little catalog of my graduate students, and thinking how much for each of them their work has been altered by COVID. But I don't think it has diminished the quality of their work at all. I think that they work just as hard, and that they are really engaged with thinking and making. It's harder, as you say, everybody's dispersed, and while if they're in Boston, they can go and use our facilities, one at a time. I imagine that one of the big losses is that they're not making objects in the same way, that it's more digital production. So I look forward to getting back to the labs.
It looks like we have a question in the chat from Kat. She says, "Thank you for sharing your incredible work. I'm curious if you still collaborate with your father on various projects."
I have never collaborated with him. Maybe I was unclear. He just took me on a trip to Iceland that time. I guess because my father, my mother was a photographer. She's still with us, but she's not a photographer right now. And my father is a writer, and so that had an amazing influence on the way that I thought about both those things and how they can be combined. And I just also think language and photography are so close to each other and so related, and it's part of what I love about it. But my father definitely thinks about a lot of the same things that I'm thinking about. But we actually he's 90, by the way, and he's writing several books. So, but we are going to do a little project together. So it's funny you should ask, but yes, we're talking about that and beginning something. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes.
And Yang, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I think your photos in the exhibition, The Art of Trees, are the ones that are the most astonishing. But I think it's also interesting to see so many other different types of photos you've taken. So I think my question is about the one that's a representation of something that's sublime, of a fire. So we see a lot of smokes. There are also other paintings, photos that are kind of photos of ruins. So it might be difficult to ask my question. So maybe I will start with something that's parallel to this. So we use the word tragedy in two senses. So we can use that to refer to a genre, a theater. So when people watch a tragedy on stage, they are going to experience something that Plato calls catharsis. And Plato actually says that it will lift the audience to a different place. So in a way, they escape reality. But we also use the word tragedy to refer to real events in reality. So my question is, what do you think would be the difference between real fire, forest fire, and the photo of it? The real ruins and the photos of ruins, because you kind of make them look beautiful and sublime. So I'm wondering, what's really the role of photography? What's the role of representation here? Thank you.
I can only try to answer that in my own for my own work, but for me, the role of photography is to bring all those things that you're talking about together, like the idea of tragedy. I mean, this is a tragedy unfolding in our very, and we're having a hard time seeing, you know, we have a hard time. I think it's very hard for people to understand what's happening we're like the frogs and the proverbial frogs in the heating water, right? So we know it's a tragedy, but we can't quite get there to fix it or fix ourselves or change so I guess for me, the role of that, I think I experienced the world in those two ways, like that the world is incredibly beautiful and also incredibly sad. And so that I think I seek that message to come through. Here we live here, we have this planet is sublime. So I want to recognize the sublime aspect of the planet. But I also want to recognize, you went away. I'm sorry. I also want to recognize that that there is a tragedy and that it is apocalyptic, and that catharsis is kind of necessary. I'm going to show you them one more picture, because I'm working on an installation for this summer, and this is just a mock-up of it, and you will recognize some of the pictures on the wall, and then people will walk on the fire on the floor. So it's a way of trying to have a more immersive experience with, even though I think one of the reasons I stick with the 8x10 also is that on an 8x10 sheet of film, most of you, if you're young, you don't even remember 35 millimeter, but that's a huge piece of film. So you get incredible detail out of it. You can see everything much more than the eye takes in. So anyway, I try to keep those two things not necessarily in balance, but alive in my work. And yeah, I guess that's the answer.
Yeah,
Did I answer your question?
I think you have basically answered my question. I think that's why we need art. I think your art has make it a little bit more bearable to face tragedy in reality.
Thank you very much for saying that, because I try, and sometimes I think my pictures are so apocalyptic and maybe, but I am trying to find that balance. and that it's personal too, to bring the really personal right there.
We have one more question in the chat here from Jill Franco. That installation is extraordinary. I agree. She's wondering, what is the future location of the installation?
It's going to be at, I mean, let's see how it looks in real life. Right now, this is just a digital version of it. So I'm feeling, I've never done anything like this before, so we'll see how it looks once it's done. But I wanted to take a risk with this, and of course there are the trees, so it's good to show it to you. It will be at the Sun Valley Museum of Art, which is a very tiny place, but they do good work in August.
Hey, may I ask a question?
Sure.
May I ask a question? I have a G617 format camera, which, like your work, allows you to look into the photo. The images are so enormous and so detailed, but I never blow them up as large as you do. And I just wonder, how do you make the decision of which ones you're going to enlarge? Because the expense of making the enlargements, forget about the expense of just taking the picture, the expense of the enlargement must involve a lot of serious decision-making. Do you have a decision process in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I say to my students, photography is 99% failure. And so and you sort of have to accept that, right? So it's hard. I mean, now I'm better than that because I also don't take as many pictures. So, but it ends up being very few. I mean, I'll work on an image, I'll print it digitally, I'll scan the negative, print it digitally, work on that for a long time, but most of them fall away. It isn't that many that stay with me in my work. I mean, I just edit out almost everything, but that takes time, right? So at first, when I make my pictures, I'm in love with them. So then I have to wait until I can see them more clearly. And then sometimes I stick with them and sometimes I don't. So yeah, it's been interesting going back to really early work from, you know, my 20s and early 30s and looking at that again now and seeing what I see differently.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, and when you enlarge them, it's a huge decision because it's a huge amount of money. So yeah,
Right, sure.
Economics has a place there.
Well, thank you for that invaluable comment that photography is 99% failure, just like the Baseball Hall of Fame. 75% of the people who got there were total failures, and yet there they are.
So are you printing your pieces now, and what kind of paper do you use? Sorry, that's a little wonky.
That's okay. I like the Canson Beretta a lot, and so I use that a lot. And I don't print them beyond about 16 by 20. Once they get huge, I have a man that I've worked with for many years, and we work together on the enlargements.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think that we can conclude. And thank you again, Laura, for this magnificent talk.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I hope I get to come there one day and meet you all. And
I hope so too.
For spending time on Zoom with me.